Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, this is going to feel a little bit weird for a lot of you listening because I've actually been away from my podcast mic for over 10 days as I've enjoyed a week on a beach in sunny Crete over in Greece, doing nothing but soaking up a little sun at the Mythos Palace. But you might not have known that because I ensured that there were still 10 podcast episodes going out in my absence. And while I was away, I think Crete had 8 cases of COVID on the entire island, where here in the UK, I've been reading about 3,400 a day, but I have to self-isolate because I've been out of the country. What's all that about? It sounds to me like I would have been safer staying where I was, but unfortunately that wasn't possible. And although I have returned in good spirits and fully recharged, I was struck down with a nasty flare-up of gout while I was away, which I think means I'm officially old and eat and drink too much. So I need to do something about that. But what I did learn from my travels was the great use of technology in living with COVID, rather than just locking ourselves away. For example, the hotel that I was stopping at, which was called the Mythos Palace, had removed all menus to save people passing them round and sharing them at every single table. Instead, there was a QR code sticker which gave the restaurant menu or cocktail menu all available on your own smartphone. And my temperature was taken at the hotel upon arrival, which again was great examples of how technology was being used to make the hotel more welcoming and work alongside COVID, because I don't think it's going anywhere soon. But I felt incredibly safe, and the entire team there, from everybody at reception to the bar staff, the restaurant staff, were all absolutely incredible. But this is a tech podcast, not Neil's travel adventures. And many of you might remember that Andres Rodriguez, the founder and CTO at Nasuni, who was also the former CTO of the New York Times, was on this podcast some time ago. And Andres at the time spoke about how he overcome the challenge of how to scale web services from 10,000 internal users to millions of subscribers. But this time around, with phishing scams related to COVID-19 beginning as early as January and showing no signs of slowing down. In fact, by March, the number of these emails had grown by 667%. So with so many workers going remote, and now some going back to the office, it's no wonder that security is now top of mind for IT and security folks. So I decided to invite them back on. And this time around, it's David Shaw, Chief Science Officer of Nasuni, who's going to be our guest today. And he's going to be talking about the alternatives to backup and the subject of continuous file versioning, which continuously loads file deltas to the cloud for safe and easy accessible storage, making the recovery process easier and, more critically, faster. And when I say faster, I mean within minutes, minimising costly downtime. And in a world of phishing attempts and ransomware attacks, I think it's a very important topic to tackle. So buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to Boston so we can speak with David Shaw, Chief Science Officer at Nasuni. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is David Shaw, and I'm the Chief Science Officer at Nasuni. One of the founding engineers here from way back. I wrote a good chunk of the original product. These days, I mostly look at new technologies, future directions, improvements to the current product, particularly around security and scalability, performance. I still get to write code. I still have my compiler. I'm not willing to give that up.
So I invited you on the podcast today to learn a little bit more about how traditional backups, often an organization's last line of defense against a disaster, are typically outdated and costing them more time and money. So can you expand on that problem, the scale of it, and why it's such an important topic right now?
Sure, yeah. I mean, just the phrase you said yourself, the last line of defense, it really carries this notion of a thing you just don't want to be forced into. The all else has failed idea. And the reality is backups are critical. And, for most use cases, they're always going to be critical, but they're really hard to manage well. You run them too often, using up lots of resources. If you don't run them often enough, you don't have good granularity when you need to do a restore, and you're always going to have to do a restore eventually. So no one wants to find out the data they need, is written and lost in between backup runs. So one of the nice things about Nasuni is it makes restoring from backup just so much less painful than that. And managing the idea of backup so much less painful. When you have a version file system, continuously version, it's pretty easy just to roll, the such and such file back in time before it was damaged or deleted or, infected with ransomware.
And just listening to you talk, I was getting flashbacks from my IT days, and a lot has changed since I'd left that world behind. So I've got to ask, what is the alternative to babysitting backups to find out if they worked or not, and rotating and refreshing tape and disk media? And in the end, does it still take hours or days to recover?
With versioning, continuous versioning, you're basically creating backups as you go. Or looking at another way, you're never not backing up. You're always backing up. And you don't have to do anything special to do it. It's just part of the storage system. You don't have to really think about it until you need it. And then it's there waiting for you.
And I'm sure everything that we're talking about is going to resonate with a lot of people listening or even watching too. But to bring what we're talking about to life here, do you have any real life anecdotes about customers who were able to recover files within minutes and maintain productivity without breaking stride? Because we've all heard the horror stories. That'd be great to hear some positive ones.
Right. It's funny though. Like, people ask that question. I've gotten that question a number of times. And I always think of it's this big pivotal moment in a movie. Doom is on the horizon. The music swells. The orchestra is going. Our intrepid band of heroes saves the world. And something? The funny thing is, I guess even the impressive thing, it's not really that dramatic. The customer is terribly happy about, being saved, and that's pretty cinematic. But it really goes. Customer gets infected with ransomware. Their files are encrypted. They get the ransom demand. They're very unhappy, and they just roll back the clock to before the first infection and just keep going. Time travel is a very powerful thing. The restore time it's not dependent on the size of the file. It's not dependent on how far in the past it is. It's not really dependent on anything. So it's super fast. The older file, original file, pre-infection file, just pops right back where it was, and they just keep going. So I guess the dramatic piece here is just how undramatic it is. So people are very pleased how non-dramatic this is.
But you say it's non-dramatic, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of people listening that have been dealt with ransomware problems and realise that things that they thought were backed up weren't backed up. Are there some negative stories that you get to hear as well, and that's when they come to you for help? Because typically I think people can be very reactive rather than proactive. Is that something that's changing?
It is. We certainly have had new customers come to us and say, hey, we just went through, this really horrible case with ransomware, and we never want to do that again. Yeah. So we're coming to you. We've heard from other companies, we've heard from the industry, that you have this method for avoiding the problem. So we've certainly had our share of customers coming to us after they've been infected to ensure that they don't get it again, or rather, if they do get it again, they can recover, within a few minutes. And we certainly have customers who, I can't give you the names, of course, who call us, in a panic saying, hey, we've been infected. We think it happened roughly around this time. We're rolling back, and they can just do that.
So the question I've got to ask, because we'll have people listening from all over the world, and some will be hearing about you for the first time. So what is Nasuni, and how does it work?
Depends who you ask. There's a, for some people, it's a NAS you don't need to back up. For some people, it's a shared file system across multiple sites. For some, it's version control. It's ransomware protection. There's the old folktale, the six blind men and the elephant. And from everyone's perspective, they see a little bit different. The reality is, it's all of that. It's basically what you can do when you've got your file system built for the cloud. And when you have that notion, and you've got local copies on the edge, but your gold copies in the cloud, that gives you a lot of power, and it gives you a lot of ability to slice and dice and view that data from different ways. You're only sending deltas to the cloud, so it's quick, And once you have deltas in the cloud, you can look at them from different angles and see different versions. So we don't do like a base version that applies deltas on top of it. So then you have to continually replay your deltas. Deltas are fully fledged objects for us. So it's like a translucent file system. And from which perspective, from which jumping on point, you can see a totally different version of the file system, either in the past or in the future, from any given moment.
And what are the biggest benefits, would you say, to any business leaders listening out there?
Business continuity is a huge one. Obviously, if something goes wrong, having your data in the cloud means you can get it back very quickly. We have a disaster recovery process, and disaster recovery is not, reload the disks from tape or, chase any of that stuff down. Disaster recovery is reconnect to the cloud where the gold copy always was and is maintained. So you're making a connection to something that exists, and that's very quick because really the only object you're really restoring is the root file system, the root directory of the root file system. So that's fast, minutes, and all of a sudden all of your data just magically reappears.
Are there any myths as well that you come across in when it comes to backups and disaster recovery? Because there are so many different stories that we're all reading online all the time, aren't we?
I mean, I've read myths, that the cloud is not safe. I've read myths the cloud is not secure. Obviously, you can make the cloud secure. That's what encryption is very good for. This is a very classic use of encryption. There are ways of doing it that make it safer. You obviously want to ensure that your whoever your vendor is doesn't have access to the key. It has to be a customer held key. That's that to me is like that's sort of question one. It's always a very complicated question, the security of data in the cloud. But a good proxy for many more in-depth questions, which you should get into eventually, is who has the key.
Yeah. Absolutely. And of course, many businesses all over the world, we're in a period of uncertainty, and we're on two different sides of the pond here facing the same challenges. So I think a lot of businesses are increasingly looking for ROI on any new IT project before signing it off. So what are the main challenges Nasuni can help businesses overcome on that front?
Well, there's certainly a cost savings.
Yeah.
Obviously, doing it this way, there's going to be significant cost savings over racks and racks of servers with storage in them, and so less reliance on those servers, less reliance on the cost of upgrading those servers, of cost of managing those servers. In addition, you get a bunch of things, some of which are actually particularly relevant now. With COVID-19, there's a lot of people working from home. And a lot of people working from home, a lot of people working remotely. They're not in the office. So file collaboration, file sharing, these are all things that a cloud-based file system makes easier and makes more straightforward.
And that should keep all the business leaders and decision makers happy. But obviously, you're an engineer by heart as well. So for all those techies that want to take a look under the hood, I've got to ask a few questions here. I mean, what kind of file types does it support? And are there any limits on the number of files it can store? They're just a few quick ones that come from my former IT brain, but there's probably a few other things as well.
Well, we appear like a NAS on the local network. So like any file type you could write to a NAS, you could write to us. It's not really more complex than that. There's not a file size limit. So really any file size, Office documents tend to be small, game images, multi-gigabyte, really, really enormous video files. It doesn't really matter. For us, larger files are chunked. So read to the file that isn't in cache. It just brings in the piece needed, not the whole file. That's important for speed. And, caches these days are large enough that really most of your recently accessed files are already going to be locally stored by the time they're needed. And we have intelligent prefetch to ensure that. In terms of number of files, really not. Our cloud file system was explicitly designed to not need a database of files, which can eventually just get too large, has to be managed. Our file system works a little bit like a local file system. Directories contain files, and more directories. Path defines the file. So there's no single table or a single database that can, fill up.
And as somebody that's been an engineer that's seen what happens when things do go wrong, and they go wrong quite quickly and have a huge significant impact. And you also see what can happen when you do things the right way and prepare in the right way. So what kind of message would you leave to any business leader listening out there to the conversation today on what they should and what they shouldn't do?
Well, I certainly recommend continuous versioning. I think it is the future of where to be looking for your data protection. The idea of putting things in the cloud on top of continuous versioning, that makes sense from a business perspective because of the cost reasons, because of all this stuff that it enables. You have, when you've got data in the cloud, and we have various tools for, aside from the main Firewall, we have an analytics product which can do gigantic jobs on huge chunks of data all at the same time. You have this power that you didn't have when you stored it locally. So combine more power and less cost and less difficulty is a pretty compelling argument.
Excellent. And I appreciate that you probably started this year excited at the prospect of a new year, a new decade, and lots of plans ahead. But of course, the world has completely changed. And how you answer this next question will probably change and again another 6 months. But you probably can't share too much. But what's next for Nasuni? Is there anything you can leave us with today?
Well, we have our 9.0 version of the product coming out fairly soon. There's some great new features. In general, though, we're looking at deeper integrations, certifications with more cloud infrastructure. We're doing more work with AWS and Microsoft. We're particularly doing work for multi-site synchronization performance. So, I write a file in New York, and you can read it, in Sydney, and that performance, that idea of being able to treat it as if it's one single file system, even though we're on two different pieces of hardware, that is getting faster and faster as we go. And we're also looking at doing scale out and scale up capabilities on our edge appliances for more performance and more availability in clusters.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. But before I do let you go, could you remind everyone listening of where they can find you online or even contact your team if they're left with any questions after our conversation today?
Sure. Just www.nasuni.com. If you're looking for the sales folks, I guess sales@nasuni.com. If you've got any technical questions or you want to talk to me in particular, you can also reach me through the website.
Well, a huge thanks for joining me on the podcast today, David. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'd love to stay in touch with you, especially as things continuously evolve in the tech world and business world together. So let's stay in touch. Hope to get you back on in the future. But more than anything, thanks for joining me today.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So a big thank you to David for joining me today, because traditional backups are often an organization's last line of defense against a disaster. And many of them out there, and you know who you are, have outdated systems that are costing you time and money. And configuring incremental and full backup schedules or pulling backups across the WAN to a central site can often be cumbersome at best and unreliable at worst. But over to you. I want to hear your backup stories, what you thought of today's interview, or even how you've seen technology improve your travel experiences in these uncertain times. And you can even throw in there gout home remedies or anything at all. Anything is up for discussion, so please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. My website is techblogwriter.co.uk. And I'll return here tomorrow with another episode for you, bright and early, about how technology is transforming our lives, business, and even world. So a big thank you for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.